Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this event of the economic response to the pandemic crisis, the European Union case. On behalf of the Center for Portuguese Studies, I would like to thank you for your
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to
thank you for your participation on this event. And I would like also to thank the Portuguese Consulate in San Francisco for one more event of the Berkeley series, the European Union in Berkeley, bridging the West Coasts, and also to thank our special guests, Alves and André Monteiro, and Professor Miguel Villas-Boas is going to be the moderator of this event. Thank you so much, Miguel, for your moderation today. And I would like to welcome Dr. Pedro P. to the Consul General of Portugal in San Francisco for kindly make some remarks. Pedro.
Thank you, Duarte. It's a pleasure to participate in this talk, the fifth and last of the series, the European Union in Berkeley. Our intention when we put this program forward was to bring the European Union closer to the West Coast and to Berkeley in particular. And I believe this purpose has been achieved. It's very meaningful that the last one is under the subject of the economic recovery. It was a very demanding and interesting and challenging exercise in the European Union. I was there at the time this was negotiated. I invested a bit of time in that, not as much by far as Rui and André did, but it's an issue to which I attach the utmost importance. So I hope the participants in this talk will enjoy and make the most out of it, because it's a very relevant theme, a very different approach from the United States and from the European Union, different perspectives and different programs. But most of all, I would like to thank very much Professor Miguel Villas-Boas of the Haas Business School of Berkeley for moderating and also summarizing the American perspective of the recovery program, and also my friends and colleagues, Rui Alves and André Monteiro. Thank you very much. It's with great interest that I will watch this talk.
Thank you, Pedro. And we will have 10 minutes at the end for questions. I welcoming you guys to invite you guys to post those questions via chat. And also this meeting is being broadcast on the YouTube channel of IES. So if you don't want to be recorded, please turn off your cameras and microphones. With no further delays, I will introduce to our special guests. And thanking again, Professor Miguel Villas-Boas, who is Gary Shansby Professor of Marketing Strategy at Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. Once again, thank you so much, Miguel. And I'm going to introduce then, start with Rui Alves. Rui Alves is the coordinator of the ECOFIN unit and financial counselor at the permanent representation of Portugal to the European Union. He's an assistant professor at the Faculty of Economics, University of Porto, and a researcher at CEE FUP. And founding member of the NIF Center for Research in Public Finance and Monetary Policy, and also the Observatory of Fraud Economics and Management. He has been a member of the Executive Council of the School of Economics of Porto, advisor for the Portuguese Stock Exchange, and invited teacher at other higher education schools. He holds a PhD in economics from the School of Economics of Porto and in the area of European economics, and is the author and co-author of several books and articles in the fields of European economics, international economics, and macroeconomics, which together with financial markets constitute his core of research interests. Thank you so much, Rui Alves, for being here with us today. And I will introduce as well our second special guest speaker, André Costa Monteiro, who is the alternate financial counselor at the permanent representation of Portugal to the European Union since 2018, following the economic policy dimension of the Economic and Monetary Union. During the Portuguese presidency of the European Union Council, he was responsible, among other files, for the Recovery and Resilience Facility. Between 2015 and 18, he was advisor to the Portuguese Minister of Finance and Eurogroup President. He joined the Portuguese Foreign Affairs Ministry in 2010, where he served in the Directorate General for Technical and Economic Affairs, in the Portuguese Trade and Investment Agency, and in the African Department. He holds a degree in political science from the Catholic University in Lisbon and a master's in development from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Thank you so much, André, for joining us today, and for both of you for your availability. And with no further delay, I'll pass the word to Miguel.
Thank you, Duarte, and thank you, Pedro. During the last 2 years, the world has really lived an incredibly health crisis, and that affect also the economic part. And so some people say, look, the big part is solving the health crisis. And here, welcome to this event on trying to understand the economic recovery plans in the European Union. So to put a little bit in context, I can summarize briefly the US recovery plan on this front. So in the US, it was very aggressive on both in this recovery, both on the monetary policy with actions on reducing interest rates, augmenting quantitative easing, facilitating having foreclosure moratorium, and a lot of fiscal policy also. So in 3 big packages, one in March with $2.3 trillion, with several checks to several individuals. We had 900 billion in December of 2020, and another 1.9 trillion in dollars in March of 21. So in the European Union, it's going to be a little different, because in addition to the effect of the European Union, the policy of the European Union is kind of in addition to actions taken by each country independently. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how the actions in the European Union took place in this front, and also some comparison between the European Union and the US. So without further ado, let's get started. And now I would call a little bit on Dr. Rui Alves to talk us a little bit about the general sense of the European Union response to the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Duarte, and thank you to all the ones that are watching us and hearing us at this moment. Let me just start by thanking the organizers of this event, and thank you for the invitation to me and André to talk a little about how the European Union answered to, or tried to answer to this big economic crisis. Let me have, of course, a special word to our friend and former colleague here at the permanent representation, Pedro Pinto. And before starting to share our PowerPoint presentation, just the usual word. I mean, what I'm going to say here and what André is going to say here is just under our sole responsibility our views do not compromise our permanent representation, nor the Portuguese government, which we represent here in Brussels. So without further delay, let me share some slides that will be useful to accompany our words. I think that they are now visible. Yeah, okay. So we will speak for, I believe, 15 minutes or so on under three major points. The first one, just a very short overview of the whole European Union economic response to the COVID crisis. Then we will focus on some details regarding what have been the two major initiatives. One mostly an emergency reaction one, the so-called SURE instrument, and then the most known of these instruments of reaction of the European Union, the so-called Recovery and Resilience Facility, sometimes named under other words, just like bazooka, is the RRF. So André will show some more light on the functioning and what we are expecting of these two instruments. Then back to me for some final words on a very short, trying to compare the intervention of the European Union and intervention of the United States in what I believe will give some food for discussion after our presentation. So starting very briefly with that overview of the European Union economic response. Well, as Miguel already said, we were facing, and we are still facing, the effects of a massive crisis. I believe this figure shows very well what is the challenge that we faced since the beginning of the pandemics. This chart provides us the evolution of quarterly real GDP for the euro area, and also I will use this in the end for also the comparison with the United States. Well, if you take a look on the figure, you will see that from the moment when the pandemics arise, there was a massive decrease in the quarterly real GDP in Europe, which was bigger than the one in the United States. And you also see that subsequently there was a big push for recovery, then sometime another period of not so much recovery, and finally now it seems that we are really in the path of recovery. I will come later again on this graphic. As you can see, the pattern of recovery for the United States has been quite different. But let me also show your attention to another path that is on this graph, which is the path of the evolution of quarterly real GDP of the euro area when we had the Great Recession. Let's call it like this, but it is the recession after the beginning of the financial crisis of 2008. You can see that, of course, there was a massive decrease in quarterly real GDP, followed by some recovery, but but GDP decreased much less than this time during the COVID crisis. Indeed, this was not only a massive crisis, but an historical crisis. Even if you took a comparison with what happened in the so-called Great Recession of the 30s, you wouldn't see a so big depression in GDP. So facing this big challenge, what was the reaction from the European Union? Well, let me tell you that firstly, this time there was some space for a rapid and coordinated answer, something that didn't happen while the recession of the financial crisis after 2018. But now we started already in March 2021 with some instruments for emergency response. The idea of all these actions that I will try to convey to you was to facilitate public expenditure in a time where public expenditure was really needed. So we pick up the most precious thing that was at our hand in the immediate, and it was, with some curiosity, cohesion policy, which is, together with the common agricultural policy of the European Union, they are the two traditional policies of the Union, sometimes very criticized by lots of people, but you know, this time the first instrument to which we that we bring forward to react to the crisis was cohesion policy. In March 2021, and then some time after with other actions, the European Union turned some rules more flexible. It allowed for reallocation of funds from cohesion policy. It allowed even temporarily 100% co-financing, and with this, some money flew to the economies. Then there was also some increased flexibility regarding the respect for state aid rules. Also in March 2020, and then with several further changes, rules have been temporarily changed in order to allow for more state aid, and that allowed for preserving liquidity for companies and to a better access of companies to financing. And in this way, the European Union tried to protect workers and preserve employment. Then a major action was the activation of the general escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact. It is not really the suspension of the fiscal rules because they stayed there, but from 2020, and it will be activated until the end of 2022, well, the governments had clearly more margin of maneuver for using a fiscal policy in a time that it was much needed, without having to comply with the so famous 3% deficit rule, or the need to reduce the public debt to under than 60% of GDP. And then in April 2021, the Eurogroup, at that time under the presidency of our former Minister of Finance, Mr. Mario Centeno, agreed on 3 major safety nets in Europe. One of them, André will talk about with some more detail, which was meant to protect workers and employment. It was the SURE instrument. You will see it provided real support to companies and workers, and the results are there. Then, in order to protect also member states, the ESM started to provide a new line for loans, named the Pandemic Crisis Support, which until this moment has never been used, but it is there if it was needed there was a big protection for member states in order to cope with their financial needs. And finally, in order to protect also companies, there was an agreement in order to provide for a pan-European guarantee fund under the European and the European Investment Bank, so to provide again companies with liquidity, and later we can talk a little more on this. It already provided important support for companies, especially small and medium enterprises through all Europe. And then this was accompanied by a very accommodative monetary policy. Maybe it was not that quicker as in the United States, but it was frankly a very, very expansionary monetary policy. For me, it reminds me the second part of the answer to something that was famous in the lips of Mario Draghi, the whatever it takes. Indeed, it seemed that once again, the European Central Bank would do what was needed, what would be needed in order to save the euro and save the European Union. And this was, as I was saying, the most immediate response. Then later on, the agreement on this was in July 2021, and then a final agreement in December 2020, no, sorry, 2020, not 2021. Well, the most known action here now, in order not really to respond to the emergency, but in order to support recovery and try to give resilience for the European economy in order to cope with future crises. The most important of these actions has been the agreement on the so-called Next Generation EU, which is a common coordinated EU response through which countries agreed to allow the Commission to obtain financing in international markets with the European budget as a guarantee, which is almost the same as a kind of an European debt issuance. And this financing would be used through grants and loans in a total of 750 billion euros to finance the recovery and resilience of the member states. That would be reimbursed through the creation of new own resources, which we are still attending new proposals from the Commission. This was coordinated with the new European financial framework, the so-called MFF 2021-2027. And this money would flow through the most known program, the recovery plan, or the Recovery and Resilience Facility, with almost 700 billion euro, through a program that was a kind of top-up for the cohesion policy named REACT EU, with almost 50 billion euros. And then the remaining of the amounts would be fueled through the European economy through the programs of this financial framework. Together with this, there were also some other initiatives. Some of them are still being negotiated within the Council and with the European Parliament, especially in order to reinforce the banking and financial sector. Namely, there was a package towards the enforcement of the banking sector. There were some actions, and there are still some actions in the pipeline to promote a real capital markets union. And there have been, and there are also again in the pipeline, some additional measures to promote the reduction of non-performing loans. So this was the general overview. Now I would pass the floor to André. He will show us some details on the major initiatives, the SURE and the RRF.
Thank you, Rui, and good evening to all. Like Rui said, thank you for the previous speakers, and thank you, Pedro, for the invitation for this event. So we've chosen two practical examples to illustrate the response on the EU side to this crisis. We have an advantage in our lifetimes, which is a sad one. Basically, we went through two major global crises in 10 years. So we are able to compare the answers in time, so the previous crisis to this one, and we can also compare the answers in this side of the Atlantic to the answers in the US, with all the differences which exist in institutional terms. Professor Villas-Boas was saying, the numbers are huge in terms of answers, and Rui was also telling you about huge numbers. And the two examples we have here, SURE and RRF, are one of the most visible ones. So they are really more into the pockets, so to speak, of families, individuals, firms. So we think those are two good examples. And I was lucky enough to negotiate them. So that was really a unique experience. Rui, I think you have the control of the PowerPoint, so if you can move one slide. Thank you so much. So we'll start basically with why. What is the SURE? So as Rui was telling you, this was part of the emergency response. And this is really interesting because this answer was unique in the EU. This was never tried before. And it was, of course, inspired by the US federal unemployment benefits, which was tested in the US. When the federal government tops up a state level support. And so this was replicated, adapted to the EU. So it was a huge innovation, and it was made possible because the crisis, the pandemic crisis, affected every country in the EU. And there was the clear notion that if you had to send people home, you had to top up national schemes to support labor contracts and to preserve jobs, for some time. So this was basically, done to assist member states' treasuries in this sudden increase in public expenditure, and of course to avoid the permanent scarring in the economies, in firms, to avoid permanent human capital loss. The implementation was very fast. Unlike the US, which has a real federal state, here in the EU, it's much more complicated. It's natural, it's 27 national governments. But so basically the Commission made the proposal in April 2020, and the member states agreed on it in May 2020. This is never seen, basically. So it was a really fast response, which is a clear sign of consensus and on the need to act. And the first financial envelopes were handed over to member states in September 2020. So this was EU financing transferred to member states for them to complement national schemes. So how does it work? The envelope, it's 100 billion euros. So it's roughly, if you take today's exchange rate, $113 US, of loans of the EU to member states. So member states will have to pay it back, okay? And the guarantee of those loans are back-to-back to national debts. So each member state has to provide its own national guarantee to this instrument. This is a detail, but it's an important one because, as we will see shortly, the recovery instrument is slightly different. So here, basically, member states pull together their collective strength so that the EU can go to the markets and raise financing and then give it back to member states. And in terms of numbers, because this is real in this case, it's the advantage of the SURE. The estimation is that it supported approximately 31 million people, okay, between employers and also self-employed persons. So it is quite an overall impact. And according to the Commission's estimations, the SURE might have reduced the unemployment levels by almost 1.5 million people, which is quite significant. And of course, by supporting employers, it also supports the firms. So at least 500,000 firms were supported via this instrument in 2020. Another benefit is for national treasuries, because now we're pooling common debt, EU debt. The European Commission estimates that the budgetary savings were of around 8.2 billion euros in savings of interest payments. And we can see that in the next slide, which is basically a table of the estimated savings through the SURE issuance. So this is a very practical example of how common debt issued at EU level, in this case it's backed against national treasuries, okay, this is an important detail, can entail very significant savings in interests. You can see in the case of Spain and Italy, which are of course big beneficiaries, the savings can be very significant. In the case of Italy, 3.76 billion euros. In the case of Portugal, it's roughly 380 million. So this is very significant. This is also a tale of opportunity costs. So we don't know if without the SURE we will make this kind of expenditure, this kind of support made available to so many people. But because the SURE is there, national governments feel the confidence to move forward. Okay, so this is very relevant. Of course, only the governments which have interest rates higher than the EU average, have an incentive to use the SURE. That's why, it's 19 member states which use the SURE, not everyone, not every member state. Then moving on to the RRF. So it's the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So this is more on the fiscal front of support. So it's not the emergency support. It's really the support to give the fiscal stimulus. So it's in the US, the fiscal package was discussed some time ago. In the EU, we have this instrument, which is not only to recover from the crisis, it's also to support a double transformation. So meaning to support the transformation of our economies towards a green and digital transition in an inclusive way. Why was it built like this? Of course, there is a lesson from the last crisis. So there is a real concern that, coming out of the crisis, there will be a asymmetric impact. Some member states in the EU have higher public debt levels, so it's harder for them to sustain public investment levels in a way that is important to sustain not only growth, but also to increment potential growth in the future. So it's really a tool to avoid the procyclical answer. And to promote the positive incentives to implement not only investments, but also reforms. So this was the way to design the instrument, which was acceptable to all 27 member states, because in this case, the Recovery and Resilience Facility is really common debt, which is backed by the EU budget. So it's not backed on national budgets, it's backed on the EU common budgets. And this is really the big innovation. This was never done in the EU, and as we can see in the next slide, the scale is quite big also. So in terms of financial envelope, the Recovery and Resilience Facility has a budget of 22.723 billion euros. Which are divided between loans, meaning that member states have to pay them back, but also grants, which means subsidies basically to member states. And so it's based on investments and reforms, which set up conditionality in the way member states have to use funds. So it's not helicopter money. It's not a free check. No, spending has to be aligned with certain objectives, which are set by what we call in European terms the country-specific recommendations, which are basically objectives of reforms and investments which are deemed to increase potential output in the near term and in the medium term. So moving forward, so we can also allow time for questions. You can see that much of the impact of the Recovery and Resilience Facility is also due to spillovers. So it's not only the dimension at national level, so each member state has to implement a national plan, which has green objectives, digital objectives, and has to implement both reforms and investments. Because everyone is implementing or is supposed to implement the national plan at the same level, there is a big effect of spillovers. So even countries which do not receive big financial allocations on their national envelope, you can see in the chart Luxembourg, for instance, it receives very little in terms of their GDP. It does receive, because of the single market, a big spillover effect. So that's a very important factor in the Recovery and Resilience Facility. This is really an instrument to promote convergence within the EU. And that's also visible, for instance, in the Portuguese plan. We also have a big spillover effect from the Spanish plan, because the Portuguese economy is very much linked with the Spanish economy. This is very important because, unlike in the US, the European Union does not have a central fiscal capacity. We do have a monetary union, but it is not yet completed. And in times of crisis, the risk of having a divergence between our economies is too big. And this is why the economic rationale put forward the idea of having this common instrument to avoid generating big divergences. Of course, we're still in the beginning of implementation. Let's see how in practice this turns out. Rui, back to you. You're muted, Rui.
Thank you, André. And now some final words before some discussion on the comparison of the intervention in the European Union and in the United States. My first note goes to the results. In a very simplistic way, with two major macroeconomic indicators. The first one on the left, the evolution of quarterly real GDP. You can see, of course, that the decrease was bigger in the euro area, and the recovery was not only quicker, but also stronger in the United States. But then on the right side, you can see some differences on what comes to the details of the reaction and the recovery. And you can see it on the evolution of the unemployment rate, which has always been lower in the United States compared to the euro area since 2007 and even before. During the crisis, the financial crisis, it expanded much more in the United States, and it became equal to the euro area for some time. Then it went to the traditional path of having a lower unemployment rate in the United States than in the EU. But with the COVID crisis, the unemployment rate grows very, very quickly in the United States. It went up until more than 15%, which was not the case in the European Union. And much of this may be connected to some of the measures that we were talking before, namely the SURE instrument and some national reactions on this side. Probably the smoother work of the labor market in the United States has brought again the unemployment rate of the United States back to lower values than in the European Union now in 2021. Well, these are only two of the indicators that we could use. Why these differences? Well, as you have seen, we had in both cases very expansionary monetary and fiscal policies. But I think they have been quicker in the United States. Maybe not too different in dimension, and I'm referring here to the dimension of the response regarding fiscal policy, in which you can see that the part of the discretionary policy is clearly bigger in the United States than in the European Union, but accounting together all the member states, the European Union as a whole, and not only discretionary policy, but also automatic stabilizers, the dimension is not so different. It is lower in the European Union, but not so lower than sometimes it is being called upon. Automatic stabilizers have a much more weight in the European Union, mainly because of our social welfare system. And you can also see that these measures at some time very different focus. In the European Union, for instance, as we have just seen, some of the focus was on the social side, namely on protecting protecting employment. I believe it was not that much focus in the United States. And underlying these differences are, of course, different models and different institutions and different ways of doing decision making. First, you have to take into account that we have the so-called European social model in the EU, and that brings us to put more emphasis on employment and some other issues of social protection. Then for monetary policy, you need to remember that the mandate of the European Central Bank and the one of the Federal Reserve is not the same. The Federal Reserve accounts for two objectives, inflation and economic growth or employment. The mandate of the European Central Bank only accounts for of price stability. As a secondary dimension, if price stability is ready to be kept off, then we can do something regarding economic growth and employment. But the mandate only talks really about price stability. Then on policy mixes. Well, in the United States, you have a single monetary policy and you have a federal fiscal policy. And in the European Union, at this point, as already André was mentioning, we have a single monetary policy, but 27 national fiscal policies, which can be coordinated, of course, but it is not the same as having a federal fiscal policy. And we lack, of course, a central fiscal capacity, which you have in the United States. So having the more adequate policy mix, maybe it is easier in the United States than in the European Union. And finally, all of this is connected to the political model and differences in decision-making process. In the United States, you have one country. In the European Union, we have 27 countries. The decision-making process at what would call something like a more central level or federal level is harder here in the European Union. Of course, you have the fights between the two main parties and so on, but here we have 27 member states fighting sometimes for their own interests. And it is even extraordinary that some of the measures this time took not that much time to enter into force. As André said, in the case of the SURE instrument, it was very, very quick. Of course, it was not that quick in the case of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. Just to have an example, the agreement on the Next Generation EU, in which the RRF is a major part, was taken at the level of heads of state in July 2020. Then it was agreed with the European Parliament only in December 2020. And we are now in the beginning of the implementation of the national plans. So it took more than 1 year to start implementing this program. And these delays have, of course, some other costs. And I would stop here, and now the floor, I think, back to Miguel, and then some discussion.
Yeah, just following up on the timing of the response. So the European Union, I guess at each country level, there's a lot of automatic stabilizers in place, and so that helps. But and so I guess you and André mentioned that it was already remarkable the how fast the European Union was able to respond in historical terms. But I guess, is it just part of how the European Union is set up? So that's so the slow response is always going to be in that particular way. And what is in the US, most of the support was at the federal level. I guess in the European Union, a big share of the support is done at the country level. What would that be? That share would be like 80%, and so the European Union is really at the central level is just residual in terms of support. How do you see these dynamics happening, and also the importance of the timely response to shocks that we know it's important in macro policy, right?
Well, maybe I can start with a word on the timeliness of the response. Of course, I believe that the majority of the Europeans would like to have a quicker response every time it is needed. But indeed, our institutional framework is somehow complex, meaning that we need for almost of the actions to have a qualified majority of member states in favor, sometimes unanimity. For instance, for having the agreement on the Next Generation EU, it was needed unanimity. Sometimes there are some issues that come to the negotiation that do not have anything to do with the big issue, but sometimes there are some national, very particular interests, and all of that delays the decision. But of course, I can tell you that for myself, that I have to confess I am a pro-federalist person. I would like to have a more effective framework for decision making and so on. But I have to agree that at this point we are not there yet. So I don't know whether one day we can have a different framework. But for the moment, this is working. Not as effective as some of us would like, but sometimes it's even extraordinary that this works, and it is better to have this working than have something that we don't know where it would lead us. On the figures, I haven't them here, but maybe André, I think he was searching for something. Maybe he can help me on this.
Okay, Rui, yes, indeed, I was looking here at some papers to have some headline figures. Like Professor Villas-Boas was saying, is right, of course, the answer was majorly done at national level. And so one of the figures I have here is that in 2020, the total fiscal support provided by member states is estimated at above 6.5% of GDP. So this is major. And if you include liquidity measures, which may or not have a direct budgetary impact, it amounts to almost 20% of GDP. And here the detail is, of course, this varies a lot between member states. Of course, a member state with big fiscal room can have much bigger liquidity support measures. So if you take a country like Germany, of course they can explore liquidity measure supports much more than a country with higher debt levels. So that links up to the risk of asymmetry going out of, well, in the crisis and going out of the crisis. Yeah.
There's some questions on the chat room, so I'll mention the question from Beatriz Fonseca about what part of the recovery plans are directed to the private sector and citizens, and also the different structural reforms in different countries. I wonder if Rui or André would like to take that question.
Okay, maybe
I can start with the first one, and then as it is more directed to the issue of national programs, maybe André can add something. Well, some of the programs for support are indeed much more directed to the public sector. One of them being the Recovery and Resilience Facility. But this is how you can assess it immediately, because the majority of the things that will have to be done in terms of investments and sometimes even in terms of reforms will have to be provided by the private sector. So in that way, I would say that much of the support will indeed go to the private sector and citizens. And some of this support is already provided. In the end, it comes to citizens. Just see the functioning of the SURE instrument. The money was not directed towards citizens, but in the end, they are the ones that benefited because they are the ones that keep their jobs and their income and so on. So, André.
Okay, Rui, thank you so much. Trying to be very synthetic. So, building on your answer. So the first thing is, of course, the recovery plan is part of a bigger answer. So you have other tools, cohesion policy, agriculture policy, or Horizon, which directly supports R&D. So the recovery plans are a big part, an important part of a larger picture, and we cannot lose sight of it. And like Rui was saying, the implementation is done by, well, the private sector and firms. Just to give you a couple of headline numbers, if you look at some of the areas of investment and thinking about citizens, for instance, overall, so if you take all the plans which have been approved, you have around 50 billion of expenditure, which is directed towards health and long-term care. So that's a focus on health, okay? Another example, if you go to look at education and skills, which is also directly pointed out to citizens and to, well, augment potential growth, you have 45 billion euros. So that's 90% of total expenditure in the plans. Okay. Thank you. So those are just two numbers. And then on the question of the balance between reforms and if their ambitions or not, here the baseline is when a member state receives a large share of funding related to the GDP, it has to answer in a comprehensive way to the recommendations made by the Commission. So it's very hard for a country which receives a large share of financing not to answer the reforms. Countries which do not receive a large share related to GDP, you know, it's different.
Just to follow up on that question, so Daniel Loureiro asks also about how to enforce the compliance with those structural reforms. But I would like you to take on first, given the shortness of time, the second part of Daniel's question about agreement on the repayment method of the European debt and what agreements have been made or not.
I can start being very brief, so in order to allow André to also to answer to the first question, as all the three questions are very, very interesting. On how this will be repaid, well, there is not a concrete agreement on how it will concretely be repaid. What I can say is that the agreement says that we will repay it until the middle of the century from the budget of the European Union. There is already some money that is involved in the Next Generation EU, which, if it will not be used, then it will be used in these repayments. We are expecting proposals from the European Commission in order to see whether we can have new own resources for the budget of the European Union, and these new own resources would be used in these repayments. On the last question on automatic stabilizers at the European Union level, indeed that's a very big battle from a long time. Now we are again in the process of discussing the economic governance in the European Union, and that is one of the key questions. But I'm afraid the result will not be positive in the near future. Well, the European Central Bank is very much pushing forward for this. Some countries also, Portugal is one of the most important defenders of having a central capacity built at the European level, not only to have a function of stabilization, which we are lacking indeed, but also in order to analyze whether we could pull from it in order to finance European public goods. Now, maybe I think André will have 1 minute to answer to the other question.
So very quickly, the way this was designed, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, is to create positive incentives, meaning then, well, it's up to member states to propose the plans. They have to be, of course, accepted by the Commission and the other member states. And you only get the money if you comply with the milestones and targets. So it's really, you have to implement in a gradual way to receive more money. If you don't do it, and this has to be, decided collectively, you don't get the remaining, financial assistance. So that's the positive incentives we're trying to test here.
Great. I think we are a little out of time. I would like to thank Rui and André for coming and give us insights on the European Union economic recovery and the challenges for the future. And thank also all the participants for all their questions.
Thank you so much, Miguel, Rui, André, and the Consul General as well. This was our very interesting event, our last event of the Center for Portuguese Studies before Christmas. I appreciate your presence today and participation, and I wish you happy holidays since we're close to Christmas. Have a wonderful Christmas and Happy New Year, and see you sometime soon next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.